The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the primal cries echoing from behind the curtain. Jessica gripped the sheets, knuckles white, each contraction a ripple of agony through her weakened body. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against the monotonous beep of the machines. It's almost over, she told herself, almost over. Yet a chill deeper than the hospital's air conditioning snaked down her spine. It wasn't the pain, she was accustomed to pain. This was fear. Fear of what awaited her, of the faces she would see, the words she would hear. Push, Mrs. Jenkins, one more big push, the nurse's voice, strained but encouraging, cut through the fog of pain. Jessica gritted her teeth, a low growl escaping her lips as she summoned the last of her strength. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of blinding white, then erupted into a cacophony of sound. The infant's cries, sharp and insistent, filled the room, momentarily drowning out the whispers of doubt that plagued her mind. Relief washed over her, warm and fleeting, before the curtain was pulled back and her aunt's face, pinched and disapproving, swam into view. So, Aunt Mildred's voice was like ice cracking on thin glass, "This is the bastard child that will stain our family name." The words hung in the air, heavier than the antiseptic, each syllable a sharp jab at Jessica's already raw emotions. Jessica wanted to retort, to defend herself and her child, but the words caught in her throat. Shame, thick and suffocating, wrapped around her like a shroud. She closed her eyes, the baby's cries fading into the background as Aunt Mildred's words echoed in her ears. Bastard child. Stain. Shame. Had she truly brought this upon herself? Had her pursuit of a fleeting happiness condemned her son to a life of whispers and judgment? "Get out," Jessica managed, her voice barely a whisper, yet laced with a surprising steeliness. "Get out before I call security." Aunt Mildred's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you have any power here, Jessica? You're nothing but a disgrace. The Jenkinses doesn't have a daughter like you who had a child out of wedlock." She spat the words as if they were poison, her eyes glinting with a malicious satisfaction. Then, with a final, contemptuous glance at the newborn, she turned and swept out of the room, her perfume lingering in the air like a venomous vapor. Jessica turned her face away, tears silently tracing paths through the sweat on her temples. The baby's cries were closer now, a fragile melody against the deafening silence that had descended upon the room. She wanted to hold him, to shield him from the cruelty of the world, but her body felt heavy, leaden. All she could do was lie there, defeated, and listen to the rhythmic rise and fall of his breath, a small beacon of hope in the darkness that enveloped her. News traveled fast in the world of the Jenkinses, each whisper amplified by the vast corridors of power and wealth. It reached Sean in his office atop the Mayo Group skyscraper, a sleek monument to the family empire he helmed. He sat behind his mahogany desk, the cityscape spread before him like a conquered territory, but the news, delivered in hushed tones by his assistant, shattered the illusion of control. "Mr. Jones, your sister has given birth to a son." Sean's grip on the Mont Blanc pen tightened, the polished metal cold against his skin. "Jessica. A child." The words resonated with a strange dissonance, a melody out of tune with the carefully orchestrated symphony of his life. He had distanced himself from her, from the scandal that threatened to tarnish the family name, yet a flicker of something akin to concern, sparked within him. He had always been the protector, the shield against the world's harsh judgments. Even if he disapproved, she was still his sister. A son, he thought, the word echoing in the vast emptiness of his office. He pictured Jessica, frail and vulnerable, facing the censure of their family alone. A wave of anger, hot and unexpected, surged through him. Not at Jessica, but at the circumstances, at the whispers and judgments that had driven a wedge between them. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to see her, to understand. He dismissed his assistant with a curt nod, the gears in his mind already turning, strategizing. He needed to control the narrative, to minimize the damage, to protect the Jenkins name. But beneath the calculated pragmatism, a different emotion stirred, something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of familial obligation, a flicker of the brotherly love that had been buried under layers of ambition and societal expectations. This child, this unexpected arrival, had disrupted the carefully constructed equilibrium of his life, and he knew, with an unsettling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The cityscape outside his window seemed to shimmer, the lines blurring as the world he knew began to shift and rearrange itself around the news of his nephew's birth. The game had changed. He just didn't know the rules yet. The antiseptic scent of Mayo Hospital clung to Jessica like a shroud. The sterile white walls seemed to press in, reflecting the fluorescent lights in a dizzying shimmer. She gripped the damp sheets, knuckles white, the rhythmic beeping of the machines a frantic counterpoint to the drumming in her ears. It's over, she thought, a wave of exhaustion washing over her, so profound it bordered on numbness. Finally, it's over. But the relief was short-lived, a flicker of light swallowed by the looming shadows of what lay ahead. A child. Her child. Born into a world that wouldn't welcome him, a world already whispering its judgment behind cupped hands. Congratulations, the doctor's voice cut through the fog, crisp and professional, it's a boy. He held the small, swaddled bundle aloft, a fleeting tableau of new life. Jessica's heart lurched, a strange mix of fear and a fierce, protective love. She reached out a trembling hand, wanting to touch, to hold, to shield this tiny being from the storm she knew was brewing. He's beautiful, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. She looked at the baby's face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of the man who was both the source of her greatest joy and deepest sorrow. Gone. He was gone, leaving her to face the music alone. But I won't let them hurt you, she vowed silently, her gaze hardening, I'll protect you, even if it's the last thing I do. Later, the sterile quiet of the hospital room was replaced by the hushed tones of hushed conversation. Jessica lay in the bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind racing. She heard snippets of voices, muffled and indistinct, but the underlying tension was palpable. The Jenkins name, whispered like a curse. Disgrace. Disappointment. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear, to escape the weight of their judgment. Sean paced the hallway outside, the polished marble floor reflecting his agitated steps. He rubbed a hand over his tired face, the weight of the Mayo group pressing down on him, a familiar burden. This was another complication, another stain on the pristine image he'd worked so hard to cultivate. His sister's indiscretion, a scandal waiting to explode. He'd offered her a way out, a clean break, but she'd refused. Stubborn, just like their father. He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He couldn't abandon her, not entirely. Blood, after all, was thicker than water. But this child, this illegitimate child, it was a loose thread, a threat to everything he'd built. The doctor approached, his expression grave. Sean braced himself, a knot tightening in his stomach. Mr. Jones, the doctor began, his voice low and measured, I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. Sean's gaze sharpened. What is it? He demanded, his voice clipped, impatient. He didn't have time for this, for sentimentality, for emotional baggage. The child, the doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully, the child died. Liver rupture. The words hung in the air, stark and brutal. Sean stared at the doctor, his mind struggling to process the information. Dead? The child, his nephew, was dead. He felt a flicker of something. Not grief, not exactly. More like relief. A twisted, unwelcome relief. The problem, the loose thread, was gone. He swallowed, pushing the emotion down, burying it deep beneath layers of pragmatism and control. "I see," he said finally, his voice flat, betraying nothing. He turned away, his gaze fixed on the bustling activity of the hospital corridor, the rhythmic squeak of gurneys, the hushed murmur of voices. He felt nothing. A chilling emptiness. "It's for the best," he told himself, the lie cold and comforting. "It's for the best." Back in her room, Jessica was oblivious to the storm raging outside. She drifted in a hazy world of pain and exhaustion, her mind replaying the brief moments she'd held her son. She imagined his tiny hand wrapped around her finger, his soft skin against her cheek. She clung to these memories, these fleeting fragments of joy, unaware that they were all she would ever have. Mary Jenkins, poised and elegant, stood in the shadows, observing the scene unfold. A subtle smile played on her lips. The child's death, a tragic accident, or something more. She'd made certain arrangements, pulled certain strings. The Jenkins family had a reputation to uphold, and a bastard child, especially a sickly one, was a liability. She glanced at Sean, his back rigid, his face impassive. He was grieving, she knew, in his own way. But grief could be manipulated. She would be there for him, a pillar of strength, a comforting presence. And in time, she would be more than that. She would be Mrs. Sean Jones. The rightful mistress of the Jenkins empire. Her smile widened, a glint of triumph in her eyes. The game, after all, had just begun. The opulent suite, dripping with the kind of wealth that whispered of generations of privilege, felt like a gilded cage. Jojo traced the intricate patterns of the Persian rug with the toe of his worn shoe, a stark contrast to the polished marble floors. He could smell the faint scent of lilies, a fragrance his mother always favored, clinging to the heavy drapes. It was a pathetic attempt to make this place feel like home, a veneer of normalcy over the simmering tension that permeated the air. He knew, with the unnerving clarity that came with growing up too fast, that this fragile peace wouldn't last. His mother, Jessica, sat by the window, her wheelchair positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Her hands, gnarled and twisted by her condition, rested loosely in her lap. He saw the tremor in her fingers, a subtle betrayal of the fear she tried so hard to conceal. He wished, not for the first time, that he could shield her from the vultures circling, waiting for their chance to pick at the scraps of their dignity. A sharp laugh, brittle and cold, sliced through the quiet. Mary Jenkins, draped in silk and dripping with diamonds, entered the room like a predator stalking its prey. Two other women, their faces etched with disapproval and thinly veiled contempt, trailed behind her like shadows. Jojo's stomach clenched. He recognized them, distant relatives, the kind who only surfaced when there was a whiff of scandal or the potential for inheritance squabbles. He'd seen that same look in their eyes at the hospital, the subtle calculation masked by feigned concern. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were here to tear them apart. "Jessica, dear," Mary began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We were just so worried. We simply had to see how you were settling in." Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked over Jessica before settling on Jojo. The mask of concern slipped, replaced by a look of disdain. "And this must be the boy." Jessica stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching out to grip Jojo's shoulder. He felt the familiar pressure, a silent reassurance that she was there, a shield against the world's cruelty. He met Mary's gaze, refusing to flinch. He might be young, but he wouldn't let them see his fear. He'd learned, through years of whispered insults and averted gazes, that vulnerability was a weakness these people exploited. "He's my son, Jojo," Jessica stated, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hand. Mary let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Of course, dear. We understand. Such a delicate situation." The two women behind her exchanged knowing glances, their lips pursed in disapproval. Jojo felt a surge of anger, hot and burning, rise in his chest. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. He knew, with a wisdom beyond his years, that losing his temper would only give them what they wanted, another reason to dismiss him, to discredit his mother. "He seems quite comfortable here," one of the women remarked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Taking advantage of Sean's generosity, I see." Jojo took a deep breath, the anger churning in his gut. He looked at his mother, saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, and knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He straightened his back, his small frame suddenly radiating an unexpected authority. He'd spent his life watching, learning, understanding the intricate dance of power and manipulation that governed this family. He knew their weaknesses, their insecurities, the secrets they held close. And he knew how to use them. Generosity? Jojo echoed, his voice surprisingly steady. A slow smile spread across his face, a chilling contrast to the innocence in his eyes. He watched as a flicker of unease crossed Mary's face, a subtle crack in her carefully constructed facade. "My dad is Sean," Jojo stated, each word a carefully placed stone toppling their carefully built wall of superiority. "The CEO of Mayo Group." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching as they landed, heavy and undeniable. "What's my dad's is mine." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and shifting power dynamics. The two women behind Mary gasped, their eyes wide with shock. Mary herself seemed momentarily speechless, her carefully crafted composure crumbling. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and shaken. The shift in the room was palpable, the air crackling with tension. Jojo saw the fear in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated him, dismissed him as a mere child. They hadn't anticipated the quiet observer, the silent strategist who had been watching, learning, waiting for his moment. He felt a surge of satisfaction, a flicker of triumph. He'd disrupted their carefully orchestrated play, thrown their world into chaos. He'd shown them that he wasn't just a bystander, a burden to be whispered about and dismissed. He was Sean Jones's son. And he was here to stay. Mary's eyes narrowed, a glint of malice flashing in their depths. "Don't be absurd, boy," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. Sean would never, but her words trailed off, her confidence faltering under the weight of Jojo's unwavering gaze. She knew, as did everyone else in the room, that the truth was out. The secret was exposed. And nothing would ever be the same again. The carefully constructed world of privilege and pretense, the delicate balance of power within the family, had been irrevocably shattered. Jojo, the quiet, observant child, had become a force to be reckoned with. He had claimed his place, not with demands or tantrums, but with the quiet power of truth. And in that opulent suite, filled with the scent of lilies and the ghosts of secrets, a new chapter began. The crystal chandeliers cast a kaleidoscopic rain of light across the ballroom, each prism a miniature stage for the drama unfolding beneath. Sean Jones, CEO of Mayo Group, stood amidst the opulence, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the swirling anxieties within. The engagement party, a hastily arranged affair, felt more like a gilded cage. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. A necessary evil, he thought, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A sacrifice for the family. The string quartet played a lively waltz, the melody a jarring counterpoint to the hushed conversations swirling around him. He could feel the weight of their stares, the veiled curiosity, the thinly disguised pity. The Jenkins family name, once a symbol of unwavering power, now teetered precariously on the edge of ruin. "The engagement party is on the third floor," a voice chirped beside him. Mary Jenkins, her smile as polished as the diamonds adorning her neck, linked her arm through his. Her touch felt cold, calculating. He suppressed a shudder. Another pawn in this game, he thought, his gaze drifting towards the grand staircase, a symbol of the ascent he'd clawed his way to, an ascent now threatened by the whispers of scandal. "Your marriage will save our family, Sean," his aunt's voice, laced with desperation, echoed in his ears. He nodded curtly, his eyes scanning the room, searching for a familiar face. Jessica. The thought of his sister, confined to a wheelchair, a constant reminder of their family's vulnerability, sent a pang of guilt through him. He'd kept his distance, ashamed, perhaps even resentful. He hated how her presence, her very existence, seemed to amplify their weaknesses. Across the room, he saw her, seated near the window, her small frame almost swallowed by the plush armchair. Jojo, her son, sat beside her, his bright eyes taking in the scene with unnerving perceptiveness. The boy's resemblance to him was undeniable, a constant, silent accusation. He clenched his jaw, pushing the thought away. This charade is for them too, he reasoned, the justification feeling hollow even to his own ears. The air crackled with anticipation as Mr. Thompson, patriarch of the Thompson dynasty, approached. His smile, once jovial, had been replaced by a strained politeness. Sean braced himself. He knew what was coming. The whispers had already reached him, the veiled threats, the subtle disengagements. His sister's past, her indiscretion, the illegitimate child, these were stains that even the Jenkins wealth couldn't wash away. "Mr. Jones," Mr. Thompson began, his voice carefully neutral, "we've had a family discussion." Sean felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He'd anticipated this, yet the finality of it still struck him with the force of a physical blow. "It's happening," he thought, the realization settling in his stomach like a lead weight. "We've decided that it would be best for both our families if the engagement were reconsidered." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The polite veneer cracked, revealing the raw, brutal truth. They were abandoning ship. The Jenkins name, once a guarantee of prosperity, was now tainted, toxic. "I understand," Sean replied, his voice remarkably steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. He felt a strange detachment, a sense of inevitability. "It's over," he thought, the realization oddly liberating. The charade was over. The pretense of normalcy, the desperate clinging to a fading legacy, it was all over. Around him, the murmurs intensified. The news spread like wildfire, each whispered word a nail in the coffin of the Jenkins reputation. He saw Mary's face pale, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Good riddance, he thought, a flicker of cold satisfaction rising within him. He'd never wanted this marriage, this alliance built on lies and desperation. He turned his gaze towards Jessica, her eyes meeting his across the room. In that moment, something shifted within him. The wall he'd built around his heart, the carefully constructed barrier of indifference, began to crumble. He saw not a symbol of shame, but a woman, his sister, bearing the weight of a world's judgment. He saw Jojo, his nephew, innocent and vulnerable, caught in the crossfire of their family's failings. "The engagement is off," he announced, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. He felt a sense of release, a lifting of a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The whispers turned to gasps, the veiled curiosity to open shock. He didn't care. He walked towards Jessica, each step a deliberate rejection of the life he'd been forced to live, each step a movement towards a future he hadn't dared to imagine. He stopped before her, his gaze meeting hers. In her eyes, he saw not reproach, not resentment, but a flicker of hope. He extended his hand, his palm open, an offering, a silent apology. He had a family. Not the one he'd been trying to preserve, but a different kind of family, one forged in the crucible of hardship, one bound not by blood and legacy, but by something far more profound. He had a sister, a nephew. And perhaps, just perhaps, a chance to build something real, something lasting, amidst the ruins of their shattered world. The opulent ballroom, still echoing with the forced gaiety of the engagement party, felt colder now, stripped bare of its celebratory facade. Sean stood near the French doors that led to a private balcony, the city lights a blurred, indifferent canvas against the dark glass. The remnants of champagne and laughter clung to the air, a ghostly reminder of the charade he'd just participated in. His hand tightened around the crystal glass, the chill seeping into his skin. He'd played his part, the dutiful son, the charming CEO, all while a storm brewed beneath the surface. Mary, radiant in her emerald gown, had clung to his arm, her smile a practiced performance. He felt a familiar flicker of annoyance, a tightening in his chest that had become his constant companion whenever she was near. He wasn't eavesdropping. Not intentionally. The voices, low and urgent, drifted from the adjacent room, pulling him in against his will. His father, his voice gravelly with age and displeasure, was speaking to his uncle. That situation. With Jessica's bastard. The words hung in the air, heavy with disdain. Sean's jaw clenched. Bastard. That word, thrown around so casually, like a stone aimed at a fragile target. It sparked a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. I've made it clear to Sean, his father continued, his voice laced with a satisfaction that made Sean's stomach churn. He'll handle it. Jessica can deal with the consequences of her indiscretions. The ice in Sean's glass shifted, a brittle sound that mirrored the fracturing within him. Handle it. Deal with the consequences. As if a child, an innocent boy, was a problem to be solved, a stain to be erased. He could almost see his father's dismissive wave, the tightening of his lips, the same expression he'd worn when Sean had dared to pursue his own dreams instead of the preordained path laid out for him. The boy is a Jones, after all, his uncle replied, a hint of caution in his tone. Ignoring him entirely might not be, he'll be taken care of, his father interrupted, the steel in his voice unmistakable. Financially, of course. But he won't be a part of this family. Not officially. Sean understands. He's focused on the future of Mayo Group. He won't let sentimentality cloud his judgment. Sean stared out at the city lights, each pinprick of light a tiny, distant world. His reflection stared back, a stranger in a perfectly tailored suit. Focused on the future. Was that truly all he was? A machine designed to perpetuate the family legacy, devoid of emotion, of compassion. He took a long swallow of the lukewarm champagne, the bubbles prickling on his tongue, a faint echo of the bitter taste in his mouth. A sudden shift in the conversation caught his attention. His father's voice dropped even lower, almost conspiratorial. And about that successor issue, Sean's breath hitched. The successor. The weight of that word, the expectation, the burden he'd carried since he was a boy. It had defined him, shaped him, molded him into the man he was today. I've been thinking, his father continued, his voice taking on a strange, almost hesitant quality. Perhaps it's not so bad after all. Sean's mind raced. Not so bad. What wasn't so bad? The boy. Jojo. The thought felt foreign, unsettling. He's a Jones, his uncle said, his voice tinged with surprise. He has the blood. And frankly, Sean, well, he's not showing any signs of settling down, producing an heir. Mary, Sean felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, at the casual dismissal of his life, his choices. She's a fine woman, of course, his uncle continued, oblivious to Sean's internal turmoil. But well, time is of the essence. And this boy, he'll be the successor of the Mayo Group. His father's words, spoken with a finality that left no room for argument, hung in the air. They echoed in Sean's ears, reverberating through the hollow spaces within him. The successor. Jojo. His nephew. The boy he barely knew, the boy he dismissed as a complication, a problem. He closed his eyes, his mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, forming a new, unsettling picture. His father, the pragmatic, ruthless businessman, was choosing the illegitimate child over him. Not out of love, certainly not out of acceptance, but out of cold, calculated necessity. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, Sean Jones, the meticulously crafted heir, the perfect embodiment of his father's ambitions, was being replaced by a child born out of wedlock, a child his father had just referred to as a bastard. A strange calmness settled over him, a quiet acceptance of the absurd. He opened his eyes, the city lights now shimmering with a new clarity. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. He felt free. The weight he'd carried for so long, the burden of expectation, had lifted. He was no longer bound to the predetermined path. He could choose his own direction, forge his own destiny. He turned away from the balcony, from the voices that had shaped his life, and walked back into the ballroom. Mary, her smile faltering, reached for him. He met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. He saw the questions in her eyes, the flicker of uncertainty. He knew she'd heard. Everyone would hear. He allowed her to take his arm, the familiar touch now feeling foreign, almost repulsive. He played his part, the dutiful fiancé, the charming CEO, but something had shifted within him. He was no longer the man he was just moments ago. He was something new, something undefined. And in that undefined space, in that unsettling freedom, he felt a glimmer of hope, a flicker of anticipation for the unknown future that stretched before him. He would handle this. Not the way his father intended. But his own way. He would protect Jojo, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. And in doing so, he might just find the family he'd always longed for, the family he'd been denied. The sprawling mansion echoed with an unnerving silence. Sean poured himself a drink, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal glass like restless thoughts in his mind. The ice clinked, a sharp sound in the oppressive quiet. He hadn't realized how large, how empty the house felt until this moment. Usually, the staff bustled, the phone rang, the very air vibrated with the low hum of activity. But now, there was only the ghost of his sister's accusations, the bewildered stare of a small boy, and the crushing weight of his own poor choices. He'd sent everyone away. The staff, Mary, everyone. He needed this solitude, this painful confrontation with himself. He'd chosen to protect his reputation, the pristine image of the Jenkins family, over his own flesh and blood. What kind of man did that make him? The thought clawed at him, a bitter taste rising in his throat along with the burn of the whiskey. He wasn't a monster, not really. He'd simply miscalculated. He'd underestimated the depth of Jessica's desperation, the quiet strength in her disabled frame. And he'd certainly underestimated the impact of a child's unwavering gaze. A soft shuffle broke the silence, the sound barely audible over the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He turned, finding Jojo standing in the doorway of the study. The boy was small for his age, his frame almost swallowed by an oversized sweater. He clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and loved. Sean felt a strange tightening in his chest. He'd always prided himself on his ability to read people, to dissect their motivations, to anticipate their next move. But this child was an enigma, a puzzle piece he couldn't quite place. Jojo's eyes, large and dark, held a wisdom beyond his years. They were watchful, assessing, not with childish curiosity but with something closer to understanding. It unsettled Sean. He was used to being the one in control, the one who held all the cards. But in this silent exchange, he felt a strange shift in power, as though the small boy was somehow seeing straight through him. He took another sip of his drink, the burn now a welcome distraction. You're a disgrace to the Jenkinses. His father's words echoed in the cavernous room of his memory, harsh and cold. He could almost feel the sting of his father's disappointment, the weight of his expectations. Sean had lived his entire life trying to escape that shadow, to prove himself worthy of the Jenkins name. And now, he'd failed. He'd tarnished the very legacy he'd worked so hard to uphold. Jojo took a hesitant step into the room, his eyes never leaving Sean. "Dad, where is my child?" Jessica's voice, choked with emotion, replayed in his mind. He dismissed her plea, focused on damage control, on protecting the family name. But now, the raw anguish in her voice haunted him. He could still see the tremor in her hands, the desperate flicker of hope in her eyes. He'd crushed that hope, snuffed it out like a candle flame in the wind. The boy clutched his teddy bear tighter. "Are you going to send me away too?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it resonated with a profound vulnerability that struck Sean to the core. He hadn't considered the boy's perspective, the terror of being unwanted, discarded. He'd seen him as a problem, an obstacle, a threat to his carefully constructed world. Sean lowered his glass, the ice clinking softly. He hadn't been a father, hadn't even been a decent uncle. He'd been a coward. He'd chosen the easy path, the path of least resistance. And in doing so, he'd inflicted untold pain on his own sister, on an innocent child. He cleared his throat, the words catching in his chest. "No," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He walked towards Jojo, each step feeling heavier than the last. He crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "No, I'm not going to send you away." The boy's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something akin to hope sparking in their depths. Sean felt a strange tug in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite define. It wasn't affection, not yet. But it was something, a beginning. A crack in the icy wall he'd built around his heart. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a stark reminder of the world outside, the world he tried so desperately to control. He ignored it. Right now, this moment, this connection with the small boy standing before him, was more important than any business deal, any social obligation, any carefully crafted image. "Dad wants me to handle this bastard." His brother's words, laced with disdain, rang in his ears. He thought of all the whispers, the veiled threats, the pressure to maintain the family's pristine facade. He'd always bowed to that pressure, always prioritized the Jenkins name above all else. But now something had shifted. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over Jojo's head. He gently ruffled the boy's hair, the gesture awkward, unfamiliar. He wasn't used to displays of affection, wasn't comfortable with vulnerability. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't continue down the path he'd been on. He had to change. He had to be better. Not for the Jenkins name, not for his reputation, but for this small, vulnerable child who looked at him with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He had to be better, for himself. The stale, recirculated air of the hotel hallway pressed against Jessica like a physical weight. Each hurried breath rasped in her lungs, the faint metallic tang of fear clinging to the back of her throat. Her grip on Jojo's hand tightened, small, warm fingers squeezing back with a trust that both warmed and terrified her. They had to get away. Away from Mary's calculating smile, from the veiled threats in her eyes, from the looming shadows of her accomplices. Every echoing footstep in the desolate corridor felt like the hammer blow of fate, driving them closer to an unknown precipice. He'll protect us, a fragile hope whispered within her, barely audible above the drumming of her heart. Sean has to. A door, slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the oppressive dimness. It was a lifeline, a beacon in the suffocating gloom. Without hesitation, Jessica pulled Jojo through the opening, the soft click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn, creating a sanctuary of shadows. Sean stood by the window, his back to them, a silhouette against the faint city glow filtering through the gaps in the drapes. The tension radiating from his rigid posture was palpable, a silent storm brewing within the confines of the room. He hadn't turned, hadn't acknowledged their presence, yet Jessica felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, a fragile shield against the fear that still clawed at her insides. "Sean," she whispered, the word catching in her throat, a choked sob she couldn't quite contain. He turned, slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, they stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the air thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Jessica saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the subtle shift in his expression, a hardening that made her heart sink. He doesn't understand. He still doesn't understand. Jojo, sensing the tension, tugged at her hand, his small voice barely a whisper. "Mommy." The word, so simple, so pure, shattered the fragile truce. It was a spark in the tinderbox of their strained relationship, igniting a firestorm of emotions. Sean's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "You can't be here," he said, his voice a low growl, each word laced with ice. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, crushing the last vestiges of Jessica's hope. "He's going to send us away. Back to them." The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. Before Jessica could respond, the door burst open, the harsh intrusion shattering the tense silence. Mary stood framed in the doorway, her face contorted with a mixture of fury and triumph. Behind her, two imposing figures loomed, their presence adding a menacing weight to the already suffocating atmosphere. Jessica instinctively pulled Jojo closer, shielding him with her body, a primal instinct to protect her cub from the wolves at the door. "Give me the child," Mary hissed, her voice dripping with venom. The words were aimed at Jessica, but her gaze was fixed on Sean, a calculated play for his attention, his support. Jessica felt a cold dread creeping up her spine. "They won't stop. They'll take him from me." The thought was unbearable, a sharp, agonizing pain that tore through her. "I am Jojo's mother," Jessica declared, her voice trembling but resolute. The words echoed in the room, a defiant challenge thrown in the face of their disapproval. Sean's eyes darted between Jessica and Mary, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the consequences of his next move. The silence stretched, each second an agonizing eternity. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a palpable force that pressed down on everyone in the room. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside the door. Voices, raised in anger and disbelief, mingled with the sounds of a struggle. The two figures behind Mary exchanged uneasy glances, their hands instinctively moving towards their sides. The fragile facade of control Mary had meticulously constructed began to crumble, revealing the cracks beneath the surface. The door swung open again, revealing a group of Jenkins' family members, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. Among them stood Sean's elderly mother, her frail frame trembling with barely contained fury. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, fixed on Mary, radiating a silent condemnation that cut deeper than any spoken word. The sudden influx of people transformed the room into a chaotic stage, each individual a player in a drama unfolding with breathtaking speed. "What is the meaning of this?" Sean's mother demanded, her voice surprisingly strong despite her age. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the scene, the silent accusations hanging heavy in the air. Mary, momentarily thrown off balance, stammered a response, her carefully crafted lies dissolving under the weight of scrutiny. Her eyes darted nervously towards Sean, seeking his support, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. The carefully constructed mask of composure she had worn throughout the ordeal began to crack, revealing the fear and desperation simmering beneath the surface. The truth, like a dam bursting, flooded the room. Accusations flew, secrets were revealed, and alliances shifted with the tide of revelation. Jessica watched the scene unfold, a strange detachment settling over her. It was as if she were watching a play, the characters moving through their predetermined roles, their fates intertwined in a complex web of deceit and betrayal. In the midst of the chaos, Jojo reached out and took Sean's hand. The small gesture, so simple, so innocent, seemed to pierce through the layers of anger and resentment that had separated them. Sean looked down at the child, his eyes softening, a flicker of understanding dawning within their depths. He squeezed Jojo's hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of a bond he had denied for so long. Jessica watched them, a fragile hope blossoming within her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something new, a second chance for family, for love, for acceptance. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges and potential heartbreak, but for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a glimmer of optimism, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang that now coated Jessica's tongue. Fear, a cold serpent, coiled in her stomach, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Jojo. Her Jojo. Lay pale and still on the stark white hospital bed, a crimson stain blossoming on his shirt. He was so small, so vulnerable. Just moments ago, he'd been laughing, chasing a rogue balloon down the hospital corridor, his small hand clasped tightly in hers. Now, a machine beeped rhythmically beside him, a mechanical counterpoint to the frantic thump of her own heart. He needs blood. Type A negative. We're running low, the doctor's voice was clipped, urgent. Every word was a hammer blow against the fragile wall of Jessica's composure. A negative. Her blood type. Jojo's blood type. The secret she had guarded so fiercely, the truth that could shatter the precarious peace she had managed to carve out, was now the only thing that stood between her son and she couldn't even form the thought. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. How could this happen? A simple trip to the hospital for a routine checkup, and now this. She looked at Jojo, his small face contorted in pain. Jojo is losing breath. The nurse's voice was tight with strain. The serpent of fear tightened its grip. I'm type A negative. I can donate, Jessica blurted out, the words tumbling out before she could censor them. The doctor looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Then, a curt nod. Follow me. As she followed the doctor, a shadow fell over her. Mary. Her smile was saccharine, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. Such a tragic accident, Jessica. Poor little Jojo. The words were laced with a false sympathy that made Jessica's skin crawl. Jessica's heart pounded. This was it. The moment she had dreaded. The moment her carefully constructed facade would crumble. Mary knew. She had to know. That look, that tone, it was a confirmation, not a question. Indeed, Jessica replied, her voice tight, controlled. Inside, a storm raged. Should she confess? Should she claim Jojo, risk everything? Or should she remain silent, protect her secret, even if it meant jeopardizing her son's life? It's remarkable, isn't it? Mary continued, her voice dripping with insinuation, how Jojo shares your rare blood type. Such a coincidence. Jessica's breath hitched. There was no mistaking the accusation in Mary's tone. This wasn't about concern for Jojo, it was a power play. Coincidences do happen, Mary, Jessica retorted, her gaze unwavering. She wouldn't give Mary the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She wouldn't let this woman, this viper in designer clothes, use her son as a pawn in her twisted games. The doctor reappeared. We're ready for you. Jessica followed him, leaving Mary standing in the sterile hallway, her smile faltering for the first time. As the needle pierced her vein, Jessica closed her eyes. She thought of Jojo, of his bright smile, his infectious laughter. This was for him. This was her penance. This was the price of her secret. When she returned to Jojo's bedside, he was still unconscious, but his breathing was more regular. The color had returned to his cheeks. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside the room. Shouts, accusations, the heavy tread of security guards. Jessica's heart sank. It was Mary. She had orchestrated this, somehow. Mary burst into the room, her face contorted with rage. "She's the culprit," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Jessica. "She stabbed Jojo. She wanted him dead. She's trying to steal Sean from me." Jessica stared at her, a mixture of disbelief and disgust churning within her. This woman's depravity knew no bounds. "You're insane," Jessica whispered, her voice hoarse. "Am I?" Mary's laugh was shrill, bordering on hysterical. "Ask her. Ask her why she was so quick to donate blood. Ask her why she's been hiding this child. Ask her." Before Mary could continue her tirade, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Enough." Sean stood in the doorway, his face like granite. He looked at Mary, his gaze cold and hard. "I've heard enough of your lies." He turned to Jessica, his expression softening, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew. He finally knew. "Jessica," he said, his voice gentle, "tell me the truth." Jessica looked at Sean, at the silent question in his eyes. She looked at Jojo, his small hand clutching hers. She took a deep breath and began to speak. The truth, like a dam finally breaking, poured forth. She told him about the affair, about the pregnancy, about the fear and the loneliness and the desperate need to protect her son. She told him everything. As she spoke, Mary's frantic denials faded into the background, a meaningless drone against the backdrop of truth. Sean listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, a long silence hung in the air. Then, he did something unexpected. He knelt beside Jojo's bed, his hand resting gently on his nephew's small hand. He looked at Jessica, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions: sadness, anger, but also acceptance. "He's family," Sean said, his voice low but firm. "And family takes care of each other." The serpent of fear finally released its grip. In its place, a fragile hope began to bloom. A hope for a future where she wouldn't have to hide, a future where her son would finally have a family. A future where, perhaps, she could find forgiveness and, maybe, even love. The sterile scent of the hospital seemed to fade, replaced by the faint, sweet scent of possibility. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the tempest brewing within Sean. His footsteps echoed hollowly down the pristine hospital corridor, the rhythmic click of his shoes a counterpoint to the chaotic drumbeat of his thoughts. He'd come to see his sister, Jessica, to offer a semblance of support, a hollow gesture he knew wouldn't bridge the chasm that had grown between them. But the boy, Jojo, the resemblance was undeniable. A knot tightened in his stomach, a cold dread spreading through his veins. Could it be? The whispers, the rumors, dismissed them as malicious gossip, but now, looking at the child's intelligent eyes, so like his own, the truth began to solidify into an unbearable weight. He paused outside her room, his hand hovering over the door handle, a strange mix of apprehension and a reluctant curiosity pulling him forward. Inside, Jessica sat by the window, the weak sunlight illuminating the fragility etched onto her face. Her gaze was distant, fixed on some unseen point in the horizon, a palpable sadness emanating from her. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he remembered. Seeing her like this, a wave of guilt washed over him, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He had judged her, condemned her without understanding the burden she carried. He pushed the door open, the soft click shattering the silence. Jessica turned, her eyes widening slightly as they met his. A flicker of something fear. Hope. Crossed her face before settling back into an impassive mask. Sean, she acknowledged, her voice barely a whisper. Her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap, a small, unconscious gesture that betrayed her inner turmoil. He could almost hear her thoughts, the frantic scramble to erect walls around her vulnerability. He stepped inside, the sterile environment suddenly feeling suffocating. "How are you feeling?" he asked, the words feeling stiff and inadequate. "I'll manage," she replied, her voice devoid of any emotion. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and years of resentment. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "The boy," he began, hesitant, "Jojo's," he trailed off, unable to articulate the question that burned in his mind. Jessica's gaze hardened, a flicker of defiance sparking in her eyes. "He's my son," she stated, her voice firm, each word a challenge. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the disgraced sister his family had shunned, but a woman who had endured more than he could imagine. A wave of shame washed over him, the realization of his own blindness hitting him with the force of a physical blow. I understand," he finally managed, the words a mere whisper against the weight of his realization. His heart ached for her, for the pain she must have endured, the loneliness she must have felt. He had been so focused on upholding the family's reputation, on protecting his own image, that he had failed to see the human being behind the scandal. The revelation rippled through the Jenkins family like a seismic wave. Whispers turned into accusations, denials into confessions. Mary, his current wife, her face contorted in a mask of disbelief and fury, confronted him in the hospital hallway. "You can't be serious, Sean. Marry her. After everything?" Her voice, usually sweet and demure, now dripped with venom. He looked at her, a strange detachment settling over him. He saw her ambition, her carefully constructed facade crumble under the weight of his decision. The Mary he thought he knew, the woman he believed he loved, was a stranger. "I announce Mayo Group will revoke its support for the 4 great families," he declared, his voice resonating with authority, cutting through the hushed whispers that followed him down the corridor. He felt a sense of liberation, a shedding of the shackles of expectation that had bound him for so long. He was done playing the game, done appeasing the vultures that circled his family. He would protect Jessica, protect Jojo, and build a real family, one founded on love and acceptance, not on societal pressure and hollow traditions. He returned to Jessica's room, the turmoil within him replaced by a newfound resolve. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and knew he was making the right decision. "I will definitely marry her," he announced to the room, his voice steady and unwavering. The words hung in the air, a declaration of war against the hypocrisy and cruelty that had plagued his family for too long. Jessica's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then disbelief, and finally, a glimmer of hope shining through the pain. He turned to Mary, the finality of his decision hardening his voice. "Let's get a divorce." He watched her face crumple, the carefully constructed mask shattering into a million pieces. He felt a pang of regret, a fleeting memory of the affection they once shared, but it was quickly overshadowed by the clarity of his purpose. He was done living a lie. He was done sacrificing his family for the sake of appearances. He would build a new future, one based on truth and love, and he would start with Jessica and Jojo. The sterile scent of the hospital, the hushed whispers, the disapproving stares, they all faded into the background as he looked at Jessica, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. This was his family, and he would protect them, no matter the cost. He reached out and took her hand, the warmth of her touch a silent promise of the future they would build together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging, a sense of coming home. The crisp, starched sheets of the hotel felt alien against Jessica's skin. She ran a hand over the smooth fabric, the stark white a stark contrast to the worn, familiar comfort of her previous life. A life she had left behind, for Jojo. For a chance at something better. Something real. The city stretched out before her, a panorama of glittering lights viewed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beautiful, yet intimidating. A wave of nausea, both physical and emotional, washed over her. Was she doing the right thing? Could she truly navigate this new world, this world of Sean, of the Jones family? Days bled into weeks. Jessica found herself enrolled in physiotherapy, the rhythmic whir of machines and the sting of exertion a daily ritual. Sean had arranged it all, efficient and distant. He visited rarely, his presence a whirlwind of brief instructions and clipped conversations. She ached for a connection, a sign of warmth, but his eyes, the same shade of cool gray as the city skyline, remained guarded. Jojo, however, was thriving. Enrolled in a prestigious school, he blossomed under the attention of dedicated teachers and the stimulation of a challenging curriculum. Jessica observed him from afar during a school event, his small hand confidently raised to answer a question, a bright smile illuminating his face. A pang of fierce pride, mixed with a familiar undercurrent of guilt, twisted in her gut. "Mom looks so pretty," Jojo declared one afternoon, his small hand clutching hers as they strolled through a park. Jessica's heart lurched. It was the first time he had called her Mom. The word, so simple, yet so laden with meaning, echoed in the quiet spaces of her soul. She knelt, her hand trembling as she cupped his face. "Jojo," her voice choked with emotion. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain the years of absence, the weight of her secret. But the words remained trapped, a tangled knot in her throat. Meanwhile, Mary's presence was a constant, insidious irritant. Her perfume, a heavy, cloying scent, seemed to linger in every room, a subtle reminder of her claim on Sean. Jessica overheard whispered conversations, veiled threats disguised as concern for Sean's well-being. "He needs stability, a proper wife," Mary would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Jessica's hands would clench, her nails digging into her palms. The insecurity, a familiar demon, gnawed at her. She was damaged, broken. What could she offer Sean, a man who commanded empires? One evening, Sean appeared at her hotel suite, his face etched with an unfamiliar weariness. He sat across from her, the silence stretching between them, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. "I'll take responsibility for you," he finally said, his voice low and steady. Jessica's breath hitched. Responsibility. Not love, not affection. Just responsibility. The word landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Yet, beneath the formal tone, she detected a flicker of something else. Vulnerability? Perhaps. "I am your mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if confessing a sin. Sean's gaze met hers, the steel in his eyes melting into something akin to understanding. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through her, a spark igniting a long-dormant hope. Jojo's acceptance, tentative at first, blossomed into open affection. He would chatter incessantly about school, his friends, his dreams. He'd bring her drawings, childishly rendered pictures of their new family. Jessica treasured each one, carefully storing them in a small box, a tangible symbol of the fragile bond they were building. One rainy afternoon, Sean found her staring out at the cityscape, the gray mirroring the turmoil within her. He stood beside her, silent, his presence a comforting weight. "You're my first woman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica turned, her eyes searching his. "Will you stay with me in the future?" he continued, his gaze intense, unwavering. A tremor ran through her. Not a question of responsibility, but a plea. A request. Her heart, so long encased in ice, began to thaw. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the city lights. She nodded, unable to speak, the word yes, a silent promise echoing in the quiet space between them. Mary's schemes, fueled by jealousy and desperation, ultimately unraveled. Her attempts to discredit Jessica, to paint her as an unfit mother, were met with Sean's unwavering support. He saw through her manipulations, recognizing the genuine love and dedication Jessica had for Jojo. The Jenkins family, initially disapproving, gradually warmed to Jessica, charmed by Jojo's infectious laughter and Jessica's quiet strength. The final scene played out at a family gathering. Jojo, perched on Sean's lap, was regaling everyone with a story from school. Jessica watched them, a soft smile gracing her lips. The warmth of the room, the laughter, the sense of belonging, enveloped her. She was home. Not in a physical sense, but in the heart of her family. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the journey she had taken, but they no longer defined her. She was Jessica, mother, sister, and now, partner. The future stretched before her, not a daunting cityscape, but a landscape of hope, painted in the warm hues of love and acceptance.